Hi, I'm Jen, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Case 6.2, Hot Coffee at McDonald's, as it has been referenced in this lovely book, Moral Issues in Business by Shaw and Barry. So I'm going to go over the facts of the case and how it relates to issues of ethics. So also, if you see me looking down, it's just because I have my notes and I don't want to miss anything. So starting out in 1992, Stella Lee Beck received second and third degree burns over the lower half of her body after a cup of coffee from McDonald's spilled into her lap. Um, at first, the restaurant's team, their legal team, blamed her for her own injuries, claiming that she knew that the coffee was hot and that she had been irresponsible and let it spill, and that was her fault, and that the company should not be held liable for it. They also claimed that the coffee was not unreasonably hot. However, the courts found out that McDonald's was serving their coffee at 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, which was 30 to 40 times hotter than, 30 to 40 degrees hotter than any other restaurant was serving it, and also way hotter than the average at-home coffee maker would brew its coffee. Additionally, there were 700 other formal complaints against McDonald's from their customers that had experienced similar situations where they had been burned by the coffee being too hot. And as a result, McDonald's started putting new lids that were tighter on their coffee cups, and they also added a warning label to the cups saying that the contents were extremely hot. The jury ended up siding with Lee Beck. Initially, she wanted to settle the case for $10,000, but McDonald's refused, and they only offered her $800, which was not even enough to cover her medical expenses, so she ended up having to continue her legal pursuits. And the jury sided with her and decided that McDonald's knew that their coffee was being served too hot for consumption. And so they awarded her $160,000 for compensation and also $2.7 million in punitive damages. The trial judge reduced that to $480,000, and eventually they settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. So how does that have to deal with issues in ethics? We have a few questions that we need to ask ourselves regarding ethics on an individual level, on an organizational level, and also as a society. So things that we should think about. Is it ethical to assume that individuals must be accountable as consumers by doing things like alerting employees or management if you have a problem with the product, waiting for your hot food to cool down or waiting for your hot beverage to cool down before you try to consume it or handle it, using proper precautions like cup holders or sleeves when you're dealing with hot items. Returning items when they're not served in an inappropriate way. So if it was too hot, she could have said, hey, take this back. I need one that's less hot. Or exercising caution and common sense when consuming your products. Organizational things that we should consider. Is it ethical to assume that organizations should be accountable for product safety, consumers about risk, appropriate packaging and labeling, accurate warning labels, I just said labeling, sorry, and listening to customer complaints and taking swift action to rectify them. And then on a societal level, we have to think about, is it ethical for a society to be held accountable for attempting to discredit the benefits of health and safety regulations? Should they be held accountable for blaming consumers instead of blaming organizations for preventable injuries? And then lastly, for them to be held accountable for placing the desire for less restrictive legislation over people's safety. Is that an ethical thing that just because you don't think that businesses should be highly regulated, even if it's at the risk of someone sustaining a serious injury, that's really something that you need to think about in terms of ethics. So, theories of ethics, we're going to talk about a rule-based example and a consequence-based example and how they apply to this case. So a rule-based example of a theory of ethics is it's utilitarianism. And basically, rule-based theories of ethics claim that right and wrong are determined by whether actions themselves are good. So Kant's theory is an example of a rule-based theory of ethics, and he claims that nothing is good except for goodwill itself inherently, and that actions are only moral if they come from a place of internalized duty. Um, all things being fair and honest, if you have a sense of duty and you operate out of a sense of moral duty, then that makes your decision and your actions ethical. Um, on the contrary, a consequence-based theory of ethics is, as I mentioned, utilitarianism, that basically says that right and wrong are determined by whether or not a person's actions are good and whether or not their actions cause the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So in this particular case, Liebeck's lawsuit could be seen from both sides. So under a utilitarianism approach, yes, her pursuit of legal action was ethical because it caused a greater good. So it caused major organizational changes so that that would prevent future injuries of this type. It raised awareness to other consumers so that they would not have to go through what she went through. And then it also forced other businesses in the same industry to be aware of this issue so that they would not potentially harm future customers. So that all works towards the greater good, which is an example of a utilitarianism theory of ethics. For Kant's theory, it's a little bit trickier because we have to go based off of what her motives were in pursuing legal action. Based on what I found through the case, I would be comfortable in saying that, according to Kant, yes, she did behave ethically in pursuing this lawsuit. She did it fairly. She did it out of a sense of duty to make sure that other people wouldn't have to go through what she went through. However, it's kind of shades of gray because if she had have had an ulterior motive, say she wanted to ruin McDonald's reputation in the business market, or say that she was just selfish and really was out to get the money, then in those terms, under Kant's theory of ethics, her pursuit of this would not have been considered ethical. So we're going to talk about some consequences of the actor's behaviors and alternatives of what could have been done differently. And then finally, we're going to talk about strategies to overcome negative feedback. So alternatives for Stella, things that she could have done that might have helped prevent this would be she shouldn't have placed the coffee cup in between her legs. That's just first and foremost. She shouldn't have tried to open it until she had a stable surface and control over the cup to do so safely. And she could have just waited for it to cool down. That would have prevented this whole thing on her part. On McDonald's part, they have quite a few things that they could have done better to handle the situation. They first and foremost could have listened to those 700 complaints of the same nature. They could have decreased the coffee temperature of their coffee makers. They could have trained their employees to verbally warn their customers that the coffee was very, very, very hot and that they should be careful when consuming it. They should have tested the new lids. They should have posted more prominent signage on the cups and made the wording labels bigger and more visible. And then they could have agreed to pay Liebeck's initial request. She was only asking for $10,000, and they ended up paying that many times over by the time this was over. And there's no constraints on either one of their parts, as far as I'm concerned, because all of those solutions were highly feasible. My biggest recommendation that I think that they should have done is listen to those customer complaints, because anytime you've got 700 people complaining about the same thing, that is an issue that needs to be addressed, and especially when it comes to bodily injury. McDonald's should have seen that there were that many complaints and done something about it to rectify the situation quickly. Lastly, I'm going to talk about very, very fast some strategies to avoid negative criticism from any group. And my tactics are address problems head on and don't duck and dodge them. Don't try to cover them up. Don't try to spin them in PR, but be honest about what's happening and address them head on. Treat your customers with respect because they're the reason that you have a business in the first place. Be honest and have, integrity with your business practices. Be willing to make policy adjustments as needed. Embrace constructive criticism and find ways to turn that criticism into opportunities for growth. Those are all ways that anytime you get negative feedback, if you can turn those things into opportunities for learning and for opportunities for improvement, that can only strengthen an organization. So I listed my references, which again were from Shaw and Barry, and I also got some information from the American Museum of Tort Law's website, which is a very fascinating website. I suggest you check it out. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and thank you so much for your time.